Welcome to all of you who are logging into the Zoom call right now. We're just going to be waiting for a few more minutes for people to log on, so we'll get going shortly after 11 a.m. Just a welcome again to everybody who's joining us and logging in right now. We're just waiting to let a few more folks in from the waiting room, and so we'll get going here in about 2 minutes. Welcome everybody. We've just got a few more people who are joining us, but I think as we're coming up on 11 a.m. now, I'm going to get started, and we'll have a few more people who are going to be filtering in over the next few minutes. But first of all, just wanted to say welcome and thank you everybody for joining us here today. It's great to have you with us in what is the second in this series of digital governance webinars that we're hosting at the Institute on Governance. My name is Ryan Andrasov. I'm the Director of Digital Leadership at the IOG. And we're really thrilled to have you with us for what I think is a really important series of conversations that we are starting over the course of the next couple of months to look at a number of different aspects of how the digital world is not just impacting government, but I think some of the really tricky and sometimes challenging issues that end up being issues for governments to have to deal with as they are adapting to the digital era that we are now in. So thank you for being with us, for those of you who are on the Zoom call, and I know there's a number of people who are also joining us through the live stream on YouTube. Welcome. As we get going, I want to just discuss a few housekeeping points about the webinar series and today's session, and then I will introduce our panelists and dive into things. I do want to first thank SAS, who is our sponsor for this series, and with their support, really will let us be able to pull all this together and put together our series of 4 webinars throughout this. Some of you may have joined us about a week and a half ago on September 11th when we had the first webinar in this series. And for that first webinar, we were joined by a number of digital government leaders from across Canada and internationally to talk about some of the big trends that are happening in the digital governance realm. So thank you all for those of you who were able to join us for that. For those of you who weren't able to join us, I want to let you know that the recording from that first webinar is available. You can access it on IOG's YouTube channel, and you can also access it from our online engagement platform, digital.iog.ca. And some of you may have seen our online engagement platform already. We were able to put this together thanks to the support of our partner Publivate. Publivate's an Ottawa-based online engagement company. I've just put the site up on the screen for you to see here, and I certainly would encourage you, if you haven't had a chance yet, during this webinar or afterwards, please do go visit digital.iog.ca. We're going to be using this site both before and after each of the webinars in the series as a chance for people to be able to engage in a bit of a different way. You have a chance to take surveys on the topics that are being covered on any given week. We have an ideation space for people to share their ideas about the future of digital governance and some of the opportunities and challenges that may be coming up down the road. And thanks to the people who've posted some ideas in there already. And we have blog posts that we'll be putting up as kind of conversation starters ahead of each of the webinars. So this can be your source to find information about the webinars. And I will just point out, we now have a learning section on the website. And in the learning section, this will be the archive of all the previous webinars. So from there, you can find who participated, the summary, and the event recordings. And on that note, I did want to just also mention from the last webinar, we did have a survey up around asking people's opinions on a few different questions regarding digital government. And this was just an interesting snapshot of some of the data that we got from the survey from webinar number 1, asking people to rank what they felt were the order of importance of a number of different types of digital government initiatives that we're often seeing governments engage into. And just to point out, I think it was interesting, kind of the distribution on this. All of them were relatively, I think from the comments and feedback we got, I think folks feel that there is obviously importance in all of these, but certainly some of the platform issues around digital identity and security of online services ranked very highly on that. And also interesting to note, issues around procurement were also highly ranked in terms of people's feeling around order of importance in terms of government prioritizing. So again, we've got a survey up right now on the site for today's webinar with a couple of quick questions around AI, and certainly would encourage you to help engage with those because this is all part of the dialogue and us getting some feedback from all of you in terms of your thoughts on the topic. I also wanted to mention in terms of today's program, the way I'm going to briefly introduce each of our panelists, and then we are going to have a question and answer period with everybody. So we'll have a chance for all of you to be able to jump into the conversation, to engage, and to be able to ask questions of our panelists. I'll remind people again about that when we get to that point, but we will essentially be accepting questions in using the chat feature, both on Zoom for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, and then for those of you who are following on the YouTube live stream, we'll also be taking chat questions in from there. So you'll all have a chance to be able to engage into the topic once we get into there. Finally, for those of you who are on Zoom, if you're not familiar with Zoom, I just wanted to mention at the top right of your screen, you'll see a small button that lets you toggle between speaker view and gallery view. And just to mention that when you're on speaker view will have whoever's speaking as the main screen you're seeing. And if you toggle to gallery view, you'll see a tiled format of everybody who's on the call. So if you're looking to only have the person who's speaking on your screen, please feel free to click the speaker view button. So without any further ado, I want to dive into the topic because I think this is a really fascinating one, and it's something that the policymakers have been increasingly grappling with over the past number of years, and that being how do we govern some of the ethical issues around AI? And for those of you who may have read the blog post that I put up the other day about this, I think what's interesting about this topic is that it really requires us to tease out a little bit, what is different about the world of data analytics and algorithms from how government has worked in the past, because obviously concerns around impartiality, around ethical conduct have always been a concern in government for decades, if not centuries. There have been laws and policies in place to try have in place impartiality around this. But we've now, in the last number of years, moved into this world of much more powerful tools that are increasingly becoming integrated into our world and are actually augmenting some of the decision making that in past times would have been the purview of human beings alone. And I think as we're moving into this interesting scenario, it is certainly an area of huge opportunity, but there are some very real risks around that. And I think it's been encouraging to me to see that jurisdictions around the world are increasingly seizing on this, and I think taking steps towards trying to think about some of this proactively. But it's certainly a conversation that we hear about a lot, and in the work that we do at the Institute on Governance on training public service executives through programs like our Digital Executive Leadership Program, we've been constantly hearing from people who are working in departments in the federal government, working for provincial and municipal governments, that as their organizations are starting to adapt more sophisticated tools that you might call artificial intelligence, you might call data analytics, you might call predictive analytics, they're feeling some pressure as well about being able to understand how do they manage how this technology is used and how they can incorporate it in a way that lets them still uphold their responsibilities as public servants. So to explore this issue a bit more, I'm thrilled with the panel that we have with us here today. We've got a great group of experts, and I think 4 people who can bring some really unique insights and perspective into this topic. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our 4 panelists, and then we'll turn it over to them for some opening remarks on the topic to get us going on this. So first of all, we have Steve Holder joining us. Steve is the head of strategy and advisory at SAS Canada. And Steve leads the team of technology evangelists at SAS that look at things like artificial intelligence, data management, fraud, risk, and emerging technologies. So welcome, Steve. We're thrilled to have you with us here today. Next, we have Shingai Manjengwa, and Shingai is the CEO of Fireside Analytics, and she's also a technical education specialist at the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence in Toronto. And Shingai's got a deep set of experience teaching digital and AI literacy and data science and computer programming to a huge range of audiences, including all the way from children to university students to adults and in the corporate sector as well, and brings a wealth of experience on trying to take data literacy practices and be able to bring them out to the masses, and also, of course, her work with AI in a variety of different contexts. So welcome, Shingai, and glad you could join us as well today. Next, we have Michael Carlin. Michael is currently the Senior Policy Advisor at the Canadian Digital Service. And Michael was formerly the Senior Advisor on AI policy at the Federal Government's Treasury Board Secretariat in the Office of the Chief Information Officer. Michael was instrumental and was largely the pen on the federal government's policy around the use of artificial intelligence and automated decision-making systems, and the algorithmic impact assessment that was developed as part of that, and actually a fairly unique development and approach that Canada took to this issue around regulating AI. I know Michael's going to have a chance to talk to us about that a little bit today. And Michael also served as the head of data governance at the Department of National Defense before recently joining the Canadian Digital Service. So welcome, Michael. We're happy to have your experience and expertise on this to talk about how government is dealing with some of these issues. And then finally, Alex Dunn is joining us from the United Kingdom. And Alex is the founder of Computer Says Maybe, one of many organizations that she's involved with as part of her work on leading a lot of thinking around the use of technology for social change and accountability in the tech sector. Alex is a facilitator and an advisor to organizations on how to use technology in an ethical manner. She's been a fellow at Harvard and Stanford, exploring some of these issues there. I'm a huge fan, Alex, of a lot of the writing that you've been doing on this subject. I refer to a lot of it often, so I'm thrilled you could be with us to discuss this topic here today. So that's our panel that we've got. We've got a great group of speakers, and without further ado, I'm eager to dive into the discussion. So Steve, I think I'll turn the floor over to you first.
All right, thanks, Ryan. I guess, Ryan, in our pre-calls, we had discussed a little bit about kind of setting the tone for the session today. So I'm gonna take a couple minutes just for the audience to really frame a bit of the conversation and give kind of our point of view as SAS and really my point of view as someone who plays in this field on AI, and then we'll dovetail into ethics. And I think the rest of the panelists have some really great credibility and ability to layer on with what I'm saying. So I think it's really important as government leaders that everybody thinks about what is AI to them. Obviously, the definitions for AI vary greatly amongst different stakeholders, whether that be a simplistic definition or a really advanced definition. I think it's really able to be boiled down into a couple of things. For me, and again, this is my definition. It's really anytime we have a machine or a computer automating a process that is normally a manual or human process, right? So it's the ability for a machine to take over where human decision making was previously required. And you could jump off that and say no, you disagree, or it's not that. But I think at the essence, it's really around some form of automation, some form of a computer or machine making a decision. And Alex, as a computer says, maybe thing is an excellent terminology to think about AI too, because often these AI systems don't do that much, right? I think that when we break it down, or when we looked at the ecosystem of AI, we said AI systems really do three things. And then again, this is kind of at the macro exec level. One is it understands context. So it helps you understand what's happening or why something is happening the way it is. Doesn't prescribe it, but it certainly helps you understand it. It also helps you find patterns in data. I'm going to give you an example a little bit around COVID-19 and some of the work we're doing to find patterns in data and people as a contact tracing application that really uses AI to look for patterns that maybe aren't aware with the human eye. And then really it helps you recognize objects. And I think a lot of the AI hype over the last couple of years has been about that object recognition bucket, computer vision, text recognition, speech recognition, and having those objects get recognized and used. And the one that really seemed to make AI take off, which was quite interesting, is the advent of the self-driving car, or the explosion of the conversation around the self-driving car. And we're still quite a ways away from that, at least in my opinion. So really, AI is about automating something that a human would normally do, and doing it in this frame of saying, it's going to help you understand context, it's going to help you find a pattern, and it's going to help you recognize objects. And those three things are done through a variety of techniques. And again, there's a whole series of overlapping capabilities that come in the AI ecosystem, whether that be a rules-based engine, predictive analytics, which I think many government agencies have been doing for years, if not decades, machine learning and deep learning, which I know Shingai is going to talk about quite a bit, text processing, vision, computer vision. There's just this massive set of capabilities that really enable AI systems. And I think it's important not to confuse the capabilities with what an AI system or what an AI does for you. And so, I think it's really important that you get your own definition of AI. I think from a best practices perspective, what we've seen in government agencies who are really focused on taking what I call a pragmatic view to AI, implementing pragmatic AI is really important. Most government agencies are not in the business of self-driving cars. Maybe if you're from transportation, you are, but don't get confused by the hype. Start with your business problem and really align it to that automation ethos, and have the computer or the technology help guide you to a more automated, accelerated decision. So that's one thing. Take a pragmatic approach. Start small and grow. I think a lot of people are trying to boil the ocean with AI right now, and it's not necessarily the best approach. It's about finding the targeted problems where AI will actually make a difference. And some of the work that I think Michael's going to talk about has really given government leaders a framework to decide when can AI be embedded, when does it need to be more human governed, and how do you find the perfect balance between human interaction and AI. And I think that the other thing I would say is really extend the current usage. You're probably doing some predictive analytics today. You probably have some automation today. Extending those paradigms, extending those use cases, and starting to become more automated will create the agility that government needs. And I think the pandemic has certainly done that for a lot of government agencies. We've done a bunch of work with a justice department, a provincial justice department, that needed to understand where their PPE was, how they were going to get it in the hands of the frontline staff, and where they needed to start ordering for back orders and things like that. So they used AI, albeit just a simple forecasting algorithm, to automate a bunch of analysis that would have had to normally be done. We've also done work around contract tracing to say, understanding an individual and starting to look for patterns using complex machine learning algorithms that build what's called a network diagram to show where relationships where they might not exist. So there's lots of use cases that are just really extensions of existing programs that give you what you need. I think the topic of ethics is one that I'm really glad to see. I predicted in 2019 that 2020 we'd be talking about AI ethics, and thank you, Ryan, for making my prediction come true. But I think there is a lot that we need to talk about. Shingai and the others are going to really layer on this, but for me, I think ethics is a pretty. I have an algorithm called Toad. I think our AI systems need to be transparent. The algorithms need to be explainable. They need to have human oversight or insight, I should say, and they should be transparent. You should know why a decision was made and when it was implemented. And that has a bit of governance. It has a whole bunch of things that come with it. The other is O, or oversight, which is governance. Again, I think I don't like the governance word. It's a little heavy, but the ability to have oversight on your AI system so that a decision that's maybe not critical can be automated 100% or 90%. Something that affects a citizen directly, you probably have, that's more of an influence opportunity. So putting the right level of oversight in there is extremely important. And I think accountability, and I know the other speakers are going to talk to this, but the accountability for governments, the practitioners who build these systems, the algorithms that are influencing the decisions, we need to have accountability up and down the chain, whether it be the human or the algorithm, that you're able to say what happened, why it happened, and know why these AI systems are doing what they're doing. And then the last topic, which is really the D, which is diversity, is extremely top of mind. When I created this algorithm, diversity, it wasn't as much in the news as it is today, although it should have been. It's really around diversity of thought. It's around diversity of perspectives. It's around diversity of practitioners, building your AI system. And that diversity comes in all forms and fashions. Their skill level, their backgrounds, their gender. There's a whole bunch of diversity angles. And I think that's really important because these machine learning algorithms only learn from what we feed them. And if we don't bring diverse perspectives into the conversation, then our AI might be biased. And I think Shingai's got some examples perhaps that she'll share around that angle as well. So I think from an ethics perspective, I try to keep a simple Toad. Transparency, oversight, accountability, and diversity is something that we all need to be thinking about when it comes to the AI system. So Ryan, that's my kind of kickoff and talk, but I think I'm going to turn it back over to you to see where we go from here.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that, Steve. I think that was a helpful initial introduction and framing to the topic, and I certainly like that concept of Toad as an easy to remember, mnemonic for people to kind of grab onto. So thank you for that. Shingai, I'm going to turn the floor over to you next to dive into the conversation. Shingai, I don't think we're not getting audio for some reason.
1, 2, testing.
Oh, now we're good. Yep, now we're good. Thank you.
I'll just be closer to the mic. So yeah, thanks, Steve, for teeing us off. So I want to start by going over some terms and just make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of when we talk about models, error, bias, etc. And then I'll talk a little bit about AI itself and what makes it unique and different to traditional systems and the way we used to do things in the past. And then my conclusion, I will cut to the chase and tell you, is there's a story around education, and I'm very biased in that sense. There's a story around really focusing on the data sets that we're using and making sure that they're representative of the audiences that the models are supposed to cater for. And then the last piece is around diversity as a risk mitigation strategy. So right on the money, Steve, you set me up really well. All right, so in terms of models, look, the simplest way to think about it is a model is just a representation of something in perhaps our physical world. And I'm going to go straight into the digital world because a lot of our activities that came through the physical world are now being represented in the digital world, and that's what we're calling models. So the simplest example you can think of is if you looked at a tree outside and then you drew a picture of that tree, that picture that you've drawn is now a model. Now, what's interesting about models is that they have inherent bias. The fact that you are not dealing with the actual tree and you're merely representing it means that you are going to have some sort of error in the model that you've created. When we have systematic errors, right, in the way that we've now created the tree, drawn the tree, and now we're using multiple drawn trees, when we have systematic errors, then we get into the territory of bias. And what I mean by that is, imagine if we had a system of trees that we drew, and it just happened coincidentally that everybody who drew a tree was left-handed. right? It might be that they start on the left-hand side of the page to draw the tree. Now, if we start taking those images and in the digital environment, use them to try and predict trees in the physical world, or we try to predict other trees that have been drawn by other people, we might find that we've got a high error rate in the way we're doing things, not for any particularly good reason. It just happens that the people that developed the data that we're using to make the prediction all happen to have a particular set, they started in a particular way, they were left-handed. So that brings us into the conversation of how does bias happen? And the conversation is also specifically about historical data, because typically that's what we're using to try and make predictions in artificial intelligence. AI is a data-intensive exercise. We need many examples, often labeled examples, for us to be able to use AI to do most things, whether it's image recognition, natural language processing, etc. All right, so that's getting us into the terms. I'll also add another term there, which is fairness. So even if we have a representative group of people, even if we've done an algorithm a model rather, that is very representative of the tree outside, we may still find that the output still is unfair. Right, that could happen. And that's just a function of there are unintended consequences in all of the activities that we're doing in AI, because a lot of them are new. So in that instance, then we have to address after the fact, usually, how do we make this more fair? Now in AI, we've got a number of ways that we're starting to think about this, some more sophisticated than others. I'll just speak to one, which is trying to get AI to explain how another AI arrived at a decision. Now, we've got a broad definition of AI, but let's get more specific and maybe think specifically what we call neural network models. Now, these models take in inputs, and they literally have a bucket in the middle called hidden layers, where all the magic happens, the computation and the math, and then they kick out results. Now, we have an area of AI that we call explainability, which talks about the fact that we don't know what's happening in those hidden layers some of the time. Right, and we call it a black box in the sense that it takes inputs, some processes happen, and then we get the outputs. So we have a big task ahead of us to really try and explain how the AI arrived at a decision, whether it's predicting trees, or whether it's predicting credit scores, or whether it's predicting cancer, looking at MRI scans. Now, using an AI to go and look at what another AI did and maybe come up with a number of permutations and kick out in natural language 4 bullet points that say this AI based it on age, it based it on gender, it based it on previous health records, etc. That is helpful to us in order to explain to a citizenry, right, from a governance perspective, how this AI is arriving at decisions. Because remember, if we have an error rate, and as I said, we will typically have an error rate because these are models, then if something does go wrong, from a governance perspective, we need to be able to explain what went wrong and who was affected by it. So those are some terms that I've just kicked out there. Something else that you should know is the way that artificial intelligence learns. So I mentioned briefly about the use of historical data. The key thing to take away there is that the historical data should be representative of the population. So I use the example of left-handers drawing trees. Well, we need both left-handers and right-handers and anybody in between. There are people who draw with their feet. We've seen those examples. We need all those examples included in the historical data set in order for us to account for all the different people that might be affected by the use of artificial intelligence, because we're using this historical data set. So that brings me on to the next sort of piece, which is, so that's how AI itself works, and those are some of the terms that we use. Let's talk about the incentives, right? So there's actually an area of neural networks called reinforcement learning, which is a type of learning where we don't have to give a lot of parameters to the algorithm itself. We just give it incentives. So think of those of you who have kids. When they behave well, you reward them. When they behave badly, you don't reward them, right? So that's an example of how we would do this. And I think that the question of incentives speaks to governance as well, in that when private companies use artificial intelligence and different technologies, if their incentives are more clicks, right, more sales, more ads, more downloads, etc., we can see how that can be corrupted. But I think we also need to unpack, if it's a government, what are the incentives of a government providing services using these technologies? If the end goal is healthcare, well, for the most part, we might be happy about that, but You know, there's a famous example of a country where they wanted to introduce free healthcare and there was massive resistance in the country, right? That's happened. So really the conversation around incentives helps us to build trust, because if we understand the incentives of a government and why they're using the technologies, and we can possibly explain how the technology is making decisions, then we're well on our way. In terms of the ethical piece of it, I look at it as a step ladder where you have moral, ethical, and legal, right? So the morality piece, we can spend days talking about that. That's a very philosophical discussion, and it will get very intellectual very quickly. So the next rung on the ladder is ethics, which I would argue is also still a little bit murky, particularly when we start dealing in the digital realm, because something as simple as a census 20 or 50 years ago, when we were walking around with writing pads and manually capturing information, is vastly different when we now have people logging into computers to type in and maybe volunteer their own census information, right? How do we then confirm all this information? The scale of it is massive. And how do we then use that data? Because we now have a lot more data than we used to collect 20 or 50 years ago, right? So that, I think the moral, ethical, legal framework is an interesting way to think about it, where I think our legal frameworks are then what we have to fall back on to drive the behaviors, to drive the incentives, to drive the correct ways that people should interact with our data and with these tools. And by that, I mean, if you had a rogue census official who was miscapturing data or misusing data, then the simplest way would be to address that individual, and use the law to address that issue. But now in the digital environment, when it's an algorithm doing it, how do we apply the law to try and manage the outputs of that situation, right? So the incentives are a big portion. My conclusion after all these bits and pieces, and it's really just thought starters so we can think of quite a broad issue. My conclusion here is we have to be educated. So we got really good at how we think of that moral, ethical, legal step ladder in the physical world when we're dealing with, I use the census example, right? How do we do that in the digital world? Because the digital world is really where the conversation is happening because of the explosion in data. And that's where governments are really struggling to consider how ethical frameworks should apply. Then the second piece is around the focus on data itself. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, none of this happens without data. So my position is that the heart of all of this is, let's understand where the data is, how it's being captured, where it's being stored, all of the above, and how it's going to be used in order to try and govern. For me, if we start with the data, then we will tick a lot of the boxes along the way, because we can cover whether the audience is well represented in the data set. We can cover whether the incentives, are we using this for advertising versus to try and push some sort of health policy in a country. And then the last piece is around diversity as a risk mitigation strategy. We're just at the point where if you want to go with a team of left-handers to do a tree drawing neural network, then you are opening yourself up to risk, because we know that there are different types of people in the world. So, at some point we'll get to really quantifying what that risk looks like, because, we respond well to particularly money, we respond well to numbers. So at some point when we can quantify that, I think it'll just become commonplace that we know that we have to have diverse teams and diverse perspectives, and we have to have folks who can look at a problem differently and data sets differently, and that will result in mitigating some of the risk associated with these new and exciting technologies that we're using. So those are just my initial remarks, and I'm looking forward to a broader conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Shingai. I think that was really helpful for kind of setting the stage on this and unpacking a lot of key concepts, so appreciate that. Michael, I'm going to turn the floor over to you next.
Great. Good morning, and thanks for having me. This is my first virtual panel, so I'm really excited. So as Ryan mentioned, I've been actively working for the federal government in the governance of AI and algorithms for about 5 years now, which in this field is as a lifetime. First with Treasury Board, as Ryan mentioned, where with Ashley Casavan and Noel Corvo helped develop the Directive on Automated Decision Making and the Algorithmic Impact Assessment, and then with Department of National Defense. But I'm going to focus on the Treasury Board bit.
Michael, sorry, I'm just going to let you know, we're not seeing your video for some reason. So if you maybe just want to try toggle your camera off and on again.
How about now?
No, it's still blank for some reason. We were seeing your smiling face earlier, but for some reason it's not here anymore. Anyways, I don't want to cut you off if it's not working. Feel free to go ahead, but if there's an easy fix to that, just to let you know. But for some reason, we're only seeing a blank screen. But we can hear you. We can hear you fine though.
Strange. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So I'm going to focus on the first bit before getting into the policy instruments, and apologies for the camera issue. The government business is very diverse, and so are its applications of AI. I don't have a thorough account of everything we're doing, but I'm willing to bet that most of our applications of machine learning, reinforcement learning in government contexts are for scientific or research pursuits. Prior to COVID, anyway, scientists at Natural Resources Canada were working with the with Mila in Montreal on a model to help better predict precious metals underground, so they wouldn't have to bore as much into the ground, which, according to them, was more efficient and better for the environment. I'm going to focus more on some of the crunchier stuff, which is how AI affects decisions that are made about you. Policy instruments, as we think of them, like policy, is like quasi law. It's like law, but it's not. It's more about how we do things. It doesn't inform whether to do something. It just talks about how we do something. So whether to do something and the ethical calculation of those benefits versus harms, it's a bit of a stickier problem. While we have a values and ethics code for the public sector in the federal government, and that demands that every single federal employee act in certain ways that we've collectively deemed as a just way of acting. And if you don't do it, you can actually be dismissed. That's really powerful. But in reality, we also have hierarchy, and we have ministerial responsibility, and that takes over many of the ethical decisions that sort of individual sort of people as part of a collective make. And because a lot of people only see a small piece of the decision that they're making, their ability to sort of justify lots of things that are going on that maybe shouldn't be justified, shouldn't be discounted. Internationally, we've seen algorithms be used by governments that are deeply problematic, from risk scoring systems that falsely flag social assistance recipients as fraudsters, to others that suggested that Black people are more likely to be criminal recidivists than white people. These are absolutely deplorable examples, but it's likely that many of the people involved in the small parts of these projects were either unaware of what could go wrong, or unwilling to accept the possibility of them going wrong, or unwilling to understand an inherent belief that they are acting in the best interests of the country, and that they are acting ethically. So an ethical framework left alone in a government context is insufficient to govern algorithms and to govern, I guess, AI generally, but especially in government contexts. We were a team of 3 at Trojan Board that basically willed ourselves into existence from the bottom up. And knowing that we couldn't sort of tackle this entire issue immediately, we started with that basic decision making. So the directive, which came into effect just this past January, is based around the idea that not all administrative decisions should be treated equally. So these decisions are the ones that government makes that affect your rights and your interests. Decisions like whether you qualify for a benefit or your admissibility into Canada. The directive is also technology agnostic, so we didn't specify that it's covering machine learning or reinforcement learning, what have you. It's just a decision made by math. Most administrative decisions today are algorithms. They've always been algorithms. You qualify for X program if you meet criteria A, B, and C. These criteria are researched and developed by policy analysts, or they're introduced through political channels, or by research in academia or think tanks, and then they're encoded as rules. And like a recipe, program administrators interpret these rules, usually with the help of manuals, and go through applications to enforce them. In simplistic cases, this absolutely can be automated, but the more complex the decision and the more impact it can have, the greater the scrutiny placed on the decision-making process by everyone, by opposition parties, by courts, by interest groups, you name it. It gets even more complicated when those criteria involve discretion, where there's no clear truth. where a decision is made on the basis of something that's not like easily validated, like your address or whether you were born in this province or not. Questions like, are you disabled enough that you really aren't able to work, that you need a special level of assistance? Should we let you settle in Canada? These are very difficult to automate through simple decision trees. But machine learning does open the door to increased automation in these spaces, as you can take a set of ideal, and you can see how this gets problematic really quickly, an ideal set of candidates as a training set and develop a model to determine what makes them ideal and base rules around that. This, of course, is really dangerous because it's sort of what opens the door to discriminatory AI influencing how you are governed on a day-to-day basis, and the decisions that government needs to make about you, or that you ask government to make about you. These processes certainly have moral philosophy in their DNA, but it's usually administrative law that's top of mind for administrators, kind of like what Shingai mentioned about the ladder. So if a federal institution is going to automate this, it has to adhere to these principles, like the right to explanations for negative decisions specifically, the right to a decision that is based on rules and isn't just arbitrary, the right to litigate a decision. Of course, there's like limitations, but on these principles, but these are like critical checks to the power of governments. So the directive effectively reminded departments of these obligations. It rarely introduced new things. It just sort of reinterpreted administrative rules for the digital age. So it requires a measure of transparency so the public knows what decisions are being automated. It requires a right to an explanation. It requires that models undergo peer review, that reasonable efforts have been made to ensure that the data used as inputs or training is of high quality. It requires that employees working with models be trained so they know what to expect. It requires that contingencies are in place for when a model stops working as intended. And then crucially, it requires a human in the loop for high impact decisions. What are high impact decisions? So that depends on the person and the place and the time. There's a lot of context around that. We developed an algorithmic impact assessment tool, which was the first of its kind in the world, but now has been improved upon throughout the world. It's effectively a scored questionnaire designed to sort a specific system or model into one of 4 impact categories. So that's category 1 models are so low impact that we've effectively provided very few controls, whereas category 4 models are so high impact that we'd make you go through a fairly intense quality assurance process, as well as sort of scrutiny from cabinet itself as a deterrent for bad algorithms. And this is to make sure that the major instruments of governance are still connected to the people that you've elected to run the show. And that's really important, that we don't sort of subtly over time replace how we're governed from elected individuals to machines or to math. I shouldn't say machines, I'm going to say math. So does this approach work? I have no idea. It's a little early to tell. I think we need a couple years to determine if we're successfully filtering out bad approaches. The nice thing about these soft law approaches is that they can be modified relatively quickly. Will it singularly ensure social justice in government algorithms? Probably not. We need to ensure that data teams are diverse and multidisciplinary in order to sort of inoculate models from bad development assumptions. We need to invest in building training sets ourselves in government that meet our perspectives of justice, and wherever possible, make sure, taking privacy into consideration, make these transparent, at least to, if not to everyone, then at least to some sort of vanguard society that we let in the door to keep us honest. And finally, we need to continue having really open discussions like this. There needs to be people like myself standing here on behalf of the government, sitting here in my office on behalf of the government and pharmacy, as you can tell, about how we should operate in this space, and not shy away the light of transparency, because this will help us give a North Star on that question about whether to proceed, which I've kind of set aside. But a lot of that is an ongoing discussion, because it's going to change over time, and it's going to change over practices and experiences. So how we tackle this, I think, is one of the more important questions of governance in the coming decade, despite it coming sort of last in the list that you showed earlier, Ryan, because it's not AI that's necessarily the technology. It's how much and where automation is introduced into the sort of continuum of what happens to you as you live in a country. So thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate that, and I think it's helpful background for people to understand, how certainly the federal government in Canada has approached this. And I think, as you mentioned, Canada has been looked at, I think, with the work that you and your team and others were doing, as a real kind of world leader in terms of trying to think through some of this in advance. And I think it's heartening that other jurisdictions have kind of picked up on the work through the algorithmic impact assessment and other tools that have been created to try be able to put some of these ability to assess the risk factors in the hands of policymakers. So thank you for laying that out, and I think it's some good considerations for us. And Michael, just so you know, your camera did pop back on, so I'm glad to see we were able to get the technical bugs working out in the end. Last but not least, Alex, I want to turn the floor over to you for some thoughts from your end on the topic before we dive into questions.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate to go last. This was such a great group of presentations. And I think I'm going to zoom out just a little bit and sort of think about AI as a system that involves a lot of people that are making decisions that then inform how those AI systems make decisions themselves. And sort of think a little bit from a government context that you've got the policymakers who are setting policy, or at least sort of high-level political direction. You've got the public and various publics who have different opinions about the role that these technologies should play, and sort of different sensitivities about the appropriateness of using prediction in the context of government decision making. You've then got civil servants who are meant to sort of take these policies from high-level political sort of direction setters and make that into policy. And then you have people who are building technical systems that are meant to codify that policy into some set of systems that provide some level of prediction or processing or automation or sort of getting the thing done. And I mention that because I think we can zoom in quite quickly into the technical aspects of AI. And I think we need to make sure that we're constantly zooming out and making sure that we're sort of seeing that whole political picture, because these are as much political questions as they are technical questions. And then I wanted to sort of take us through a sort of why, what, when, where, who of thinking about when these systems are appropriate and at what sort of shade of prediction, to think of sort of Michael's spectrum that he just described. And I want to linger on the why for a minute, because I think we see different governments sort of treating AI in different ways. I live in the UK, where I think the government uses AI as a foil to sort of perform competence, and it procures things that we know aren't going to work. And there's this sort of bizarre political dialogue here where we can see a state that's attempting to lean into the sort of language of innovation as a way of sort of sidestepping other sort of political accountability questions. And just as an example, if you asked why the Home Office in the UK used an algorithm that was hard-coded, so it wasn't learning over time, it was sort of a fixed set of criteria go into an application, and it determines whether or not an application is reviewed more thoroughly by a caseworker. The argument made was for efficiency purposes, which is a common argument that gets made when we talk about digitizing or sort of automating or sort of using predictive systems. But the Home Office, if you look at their bottom line, actually made $500 million in surplus in 2018. I don't have the figures for 2019, but that doesn't sound like a system that's suffering and needs to sort of cut corners. So I think sort of starting with that why question and making sure that we're not either allowing governments to assert that these technologies are providing a particular service or role in government, when in fact that's obviously not what's happening. And in that case, one of the reasons that it was rolled out, and it has recently been legally overturned because it was using a country system, so saying these countries are people coming from these countries are a risk or should be not necessarily provided with visas. Those countries were by and large majority Black and brown populations. So it became a tool for that government to enforce a racist policy. The sort of hostile environment is the euphemistic British way of describing it. And by codifying it in a system like this, they were able to distance themselves from those decisions, because it wasn't a person or a representative of the government making those choices. It was math. To use Michael again, I think a great point that we can't just call this math, because there's so much sort of context that goes into these conversations. And I also just, before moving on from the why, I think there's a fantastic post by a Sean McDonald, who actually has been doing some work in Canada around data governance in the public interest. And he talks a lot about technology theater. So the sort of desire to use technology as a way to perform, essentially. So, for example, in certain countries where healthcare systems are not capable of actually responding to COVID cases, for example, why would you spend tremendous amounts of energy rolling out a symptom tracker when the people that have that disease, even if it's contributing to track and trace, which is a separate sort of conversation, those people don't have anywhere to go if they need care or services. Look at the United States, where a lot of people don't have health insurance. What value is it for a person to have the state roll out technology that's meant to assist them in accessing or requesting services from a system that fails them? So I think just sort of lingering on that why question, I think is really important. It applies less so with sort of automation conversations, but I think when we get into spaces of prediction, particularly, I think that question is really, really important and quite fraught. And there's no easy answers, but I think just sort of reflecting on the political intent and the incentives around these technologies can be just a really good way of being clear-eyed, because there are many cases where these systems may make government more efficient, make it more responsive to citizens, just make it easier to access services. So it's not to say that I'm a Luddite in the sense that I think technology should be used for the appropriate purpose, but sort of there are appropriate purposes, I think. But moving a little bit to the when, so I'm going to sort of skip the what for a second and go to when. I think there's also a real responsibility on government to move slowly. And actually, I think it's really wonderful that as a sort of group of actors, that government and people in government have a deeper responsibility and a more clearer sort of laid out set of responsibilities than, for example, a company has to a consumer. And so in my mind, it's actually really refreshing to hear this level of reflection and this level of space given to these kinds of conversations. And I think that sometimes government is put in there's a lot of pressure applied to say, you're supposed to be more agile. Why aren't you moving faster? And actually, sometimes I think it's just fantastic that moving slow is sometimes the right answer. But I think when we think about under what conditions is it appropriate to sort of unleash this system on even a subset of the population through a testing process? When does innovation become experimentation on people? When are we sort of thinking about sort of the veil of ignorance? Would you be willing to be subjected to the system without any recourse? Sort of how are we thinking about the sort of half-baked, full-baked kind of systems that we're rolling out, and just being really careful. And it sounds like from these conversations, you all are being very careful about what you need to know to roll these systems out in ways that directly engage and affect citizens. And then moving to the who, I mean, I think Shingai made the great point. We don't want just a bunch of left-handed people participating in these conversations or populating data sets. So when we look at machine vision, Black and brown faces are clearly not as effectively detected in the existing systems because the data sets are majority white. Not to say that we want face rec to get better at, at its accuracy. There's just sort of a lot of politics there. But just to say that, we do want to be thinking about the diversity of the people that are building tools, the sort of the way that affected populations that will be directly harmed if systems do not perform as they are intended to perform, making sure that those communities are a part of that conversation, but not in an extractive way, so that they're not doing your work for you, but rather they're able to plug into a process that they can participate in and hopefully influence meaningfully. Who's included? So thinking about the hierarchy Michael described, thinking about how we engage people that aren't just the technical folks. So I think there's oftentimes a pretty big tension where you have technical folks sometimes make hugely consequential decisions. And sometimes it's because they don't necessarily know how consequential a decision is because they're not engaged in the policy and the politics and the sort of contextual conversation. So just making sure that there's organizational design and a process whereby you don't have individuals making incredibly consequential choices for whole systems, which shouldn't be the case in any system, but somehow in technology, it feels like that's quite common. And then I'd say who is accountable. So if the thing causes harm, what minister has to resign? Like I think there's a certain circle that we're missing, I think, within the context of AI, where when these systems fail, we really need to see politicians take responsibility, meaningful responsibility, not oops, not that didn't quite work out how we meant, that was unintended, et cetera, et cetera. We really need to see a feedback loop where these systems need to succeed for those politicians to sort of claim credit for being innovative leaders. And then I would touch a little bit on the what. I was going to talk a bit about what Michael covered in terms of thinking about shades of prediction. And I think that's a really important way of thinking in terms of when it's appropriate to ratchet up the level of prediction or analysis that gets baked into one of these choices. And I think it's just being intentional with that and recognizing that not all automation is AI and not all AI needs to be sort of automated consequential decisions, and sort of respecting that and being clear when it's which use case is appropriate for which situation. And then in terms of the how, I think a few of you have touched on interesting, I think, questions about how government should engage with vendors, how governments should think about what should be procured versus what should be in-house technical understanding and learning. And it sounds like the government's doing a great job of sort of figuring out what star players they need to have in-house so that they're not constantly sort of delegating out the learning that happens when you roll out these systems. And then I would also say, thinking about model monitoring. So once these models are, in the wild, what does it look like to monitor those models? When do you know you should actually decommission a system because it's either gone off the rails or it's caused so much harm that it's really inappropriate to sort of continue having it work? And then thinking about that sort of organizational learning process. So over time, you feel more comfortable taking on more risk because it's actually not as risky as it was before because you know more and you feel more confident at the sort of choices that you're making. So that was kind of an overview in terms of our why, what, when, who, how. And I'm also mindful that we never really defined ethics. And I just wanted to sort of quickly say that I think it's actually, interestingly, I think, akin to policy. And in my mind, ethics is a sort of shared, explicit set of moral values where there is a clear way of evaluating whether or not someone is making choices that fit within that value set. It can be very different. Different groups can have different set of ethical frameworks and standards. And it's why when someone says, was it ethical? My next question is always, well, what was their ethical framework that they were operating within? But so being clear that, these systems are not, it's not just, does it feel right? Is it good? Is it legal? It's also, we should have already talked about what's right and what's wrong, and what we have a shared understanding about what's right and what's wrong, and we should have a structured system of being able to evaluate whether or not our decisions fit within that framework.
That's great. No, thanks, Alex. And I appreciate you bringing up that notion of defining what ethics is, because I think it's an important one. We often do some modules on ethics in our training programs through IOG around digital. And one of the examples I bring up, which some folks might be familiar with, MIT had done the study on self-driving cars, and essentially it was kind of a version of the trolley problem from philosophy. And they had run this, globally with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of participants. And I think one of the findings from that was, there can be very different ethical frameworks that people are approaching this on. And so I think you're right that as governments, as regulators and holders of the public trust have to start thinking through, what are those limits and rules that are essentially put in place around how AI works. They may be coming at that from different levels, and the stakeholders they're working with may have different views on kind of ethics as a baseline bit. So thank you to all the panelists. This was great kind of opening fodder, and I want to dive into some further discussion and questions on this. We've had a few questions coming in already from the audience, so thank you for that. Just a reminder to people that if they have questions that they want to pose to the panel, please post it in the chat, either on Zoom or for those of you who are watching on the live stream on the YouTube chat. I'll invite the panelists to turn their cameras back on. And I'm going to maybe start the discussion period with a question that we got from Andrea Smith, which I think is an interesting place to start around some of the pressures government feels around this. Andrea had asked or made the comment that technology and ethics and governance can advance at very different paces. And her question is what Canada needs to do to keep this gap manageable while maintaining a competitive advantage while other countries and other sectors barrel ahead. And she was thinking of facial recognition as an example. And I think about this when we talk about digital government often, we're often thinking about the challenge that digital in government is often a response to people's raised expectations from the marketplace, right? The average citizen lives in a Netflix and Amazon world, and that kind of sets their frame around service delivery. And I think what Andrea is getting at is that same pressure, I think, is going to start coming in the world of AI and analytics, right? Where if, there's certainly, we're seeing some of the downsides of analytics. People are probably familiar with the recent Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which kind of looks a little bit how AI has been in some ways misused in social media companies. But I think the flip side is there are clearly going to be some consumer benefits that come from AI. And I think I can absolutely imagine a world where citizens actually start demanding that governments use more AI. And then they're feeling that pressure where, they may want to go slow, but they're actually getting pressure from citizens to go faster on this. So I want to open this up, I guess, to get people's views on if they're seeing that pressure. And Steve, if you don't mind, I might actually go to you first on this because you're obviously coming from a vendor perspective on this, and I'm curious, as you're working with governments at different levels, in Canada and around the world, are you seeing that? Are you seeing that governments are feeling a pressure that they have to do AI for the sake of AI, or are they taking a more kind of business-driven, approach to it, to saying we actually have a problem that we think AI can solve?
Yeah, so thanks, Ryan. A couple comments. I think comment number one is, as with any trend, right? I don't think anybody could debate that AI has been a trend for the last, say, 24 months. As with any trend, a lot of people glom onto it, and they start redirecting energy to try to show relevance around that trend.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think government in Canada or around the globe has been any different. I think the reality of it is that the government has a lot different procurement cadence. And that's something I think that as a vendor, I'd love to see change, but that's probably unrealistic. I think they have to do right by the citizen, but the ability to adopt innovation in government is sometimes slower. And I think when the AI hype hit the world, I saw a lot of people trying to spin up these AI projects that ultimately didn't have an outcome that was aligned to an objective, aligned to something, a project. And that goes not only for government, but that goes for my commercial customers as well. Like, I deal with banks, insurance, retail, I'm cross industry. So it's not necessarily a government phenomena, but I think it hits the government a little harder because that cadence and pace of change is something that's a little more measured in a government landscape. So
Yep.
I would say I've seen people spin up what I'd call experiments to try technology out. And my caution on that was totally keep doing that, but do it in the construct of an outcome that you want to solve for, right? Doing unstructured text for the sake of it, right? Not that interesting. But
Yep.
finding something that you can deliver better service or understand some of the biases that are in things or deliver a better outcome, that's where we should focus our time. I don't know if that answered the question, but there you go.
No,
I'll pause there.
yeah, I think that's helpful, Steve. Shingai or Alex or Michael, do any of you want to jump in on this question as well? Shingai, go ahead. Shingai, you're still. I think we got audio now. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a lag on it. I think it's going to depend very much on the government, right? Because it's not Canada in isolation. There are governments all over the world who are taking quite different approaches to artificial intelligence. Some have entirely dedicated departments of many engineers that are hard at work thinking about how artificial intelligence can advance the objectives of that particular government. So from a Canadian perspective, I would say we also need to be careful, right? It's about the development and then the deployment. Even if we might be slow to deploy, I think we also need to be on the cutting edge of what's possible, what's being created, and then making those value judgments of what's going to be beneficial to deploy versus what, do we keep it in-house until we're more confident about what this model does and what the consequences are. But in terms of actually being present at the table, in terms of the best and getting the best and the brightest to be working on artificial intelligence and other types of models, I think we need to have a seat at the table. One last comment, and I think this is linked to a question from Trevor Shaw in the chat about then what's the recourse. So I think there's something to be said around we may not be able to govern exactly how the technologies emerge. So private companies could be doing all kinds of things, recommender systems, facial rec, NLP, etc. But I think there is space for us to have governing bodies where a citizen can have recourse. So if you believe that an AI has been used, in a way that, is not beneficial to you, or you've been discriminated against in some way by a decision made by an automated system, then you need somewhere to go. And perhaps existing frameworks and structures like the Privacy Commission of Canada, perhaps with more resources and folks who are AI researchers, that could be the place that we could go to resolve that.
Thanks, Shingai. Yeah, and I'm glad you touched on that, because that touches on, I think, a question we got from Renee about the notion of how do we involve non-expert citizens in meaningful ways, right? And so that notion of, and I think you're right, whether it's through organizations like the Privacy Commissioner or others, that ability to have recourse and the ability to at least from a personal perspective, be able to engage with how AI may be making decisions about you, I think is an important piece to that. Alex, I wanted to ask you, kind of linked to this, you were talking a little bit about the UK experience with this. Is, and maybe this is a bit of an unfair question, and feel free to tell me that if you think so, but from the UK's kind of use of AI in a variety of different ways, and we saw, I think recently there was some challenges with it around academic scorings, with kind of end of year exams for students who were going into post-secondary education. I mean, it seems on the one hand the UK has embraced this, but I'm wondering your sense of, is their embrace of it being driven because citizens were looking for this, or again, was it kind of more of an internal drive where they were using it because they thought there was efficiencies or others? Again, I'm trying to get at this dynamic of, is it governments who are the ones that are kind of pushing to use these tools, or are they responding to pressure from citizens who kind of think there are more effective ways to be able to do some of their traditional ways of delivering services?
Yeah, I mean, I think the A-levels situation is just an incredible example. I don't know how much you followed, but essentially it was a very complex, unprecedented system failure of the education system, and a government that didn't move quickly enough or didn't center the young people who were directly affected by these systems. So rather than sort of starting from the point of departure of, wow, if I'm 17 years old and I am taking the most consequential exams of my life, and I'm in the middle of this massive pandemic that may or may not mean that I go to university at all, I'm under just incredible strain, I'm not seeing my friends, I'm under lockdown, what would I need to be able to effectively sort of prove myself enough to be able to get a place in university, but not be further harmed by a solution to this complex problem. And so the point of departure, again, on the why wasn't how do we make this smooth for universities, smooth for students, and sort of be mindful of these experiences. The why was, we just need to keep it the same. And so to keep it the same, what we'll do is we'll build an incredibly blunt tool, and then cross our fingers that people won't be very vocal when they're so demonstrably harmed by these systems. So I think it was definitely not, I don't think, coming from the public, a push for integration of algorithms in the system. I think it was a push from the public to deal with the situation. For example, funding additional spots in universities, recognizing that the accuracy of the outcomes weren't going to be the same once they decided not to sit exams, or sort of making the policy moves that they needed to make early enough to be able to actually have the education system adapt to this very bizarre year. And rather than doing that, they attempted to force through this approach. And I think it's quite interesting when you read the Parliament Select Committee afterwards, the sort of fallout when all of these different characters who were consequentially involved in rolling out the system, how they interpreted the failure. And actually the chair of Ofqual, who was responsible for education quality control, essentially, said that it was fair. The problem was that the public wasn't primed enough, essentially, to accept it as fair. And that was the issue. So I feel like, again, the sort of the why and the when is a really important sort of thing to think about, because that's not, government shouldn't roll out systems and then say, oh, you didn't like that? Well, then we should have done more work to convince you to accept such a poor system. It's sort of not how we should be thinking. We should be thinking, how do we build systems that actually sort of enable human flourishing?
Yeah, and it's an interesting point on this, and I think obviously the A-levels example from the UK, driven by COVID and some of the unique challenges government are facing. I mean, and it strikes me that this is going to continue, right, for the coming years. I mean, even once hopefully hopefully, you know, a year from now, COVID may be much more under control. There's a fiscal reality governments are going to be facing, and I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to adapt some of these things, which, as you said, Alex, can be sometimes applied in kind of a blunt instrument approach. And it actually leads to a question, Michael, I want to pass over to you on this, and certainly if you have any thoughts on this, but also kind of specifically, there was a question from Jeff Kinder, and Jeff was asking, you know, in the context of the algorithmic impact assessment and the Canadian government's rules on this, for those who may not be familiar, it essentially has kind of a 4-level risk assessment that it gives based on the potential impact of the AI, and within that, for the higher levels of risk, it suggests having a peer review mechanism in place, I think in part to try hopefully avoid some of those challenges. But, you know, Jeff's question around that is, you know, peer review obviously has a strong history in science, but maybe less so within this domain. And I think just kind of curious, I think Jeff was kind of curious in your thoughts, Michael, as we're trying to avoid those kind of scenarios where we have these, you know, somewhat negative outcomes that can come out of this, which maybe could have been caught ahead of time. You know, do you think peer review can work on this, or do you have any thoughts about how to best mitigate in the cases where, you know, you've identified there is a high risk application of it, but government still thinks the benefits are worth going through, but they're trying to figure out how to mitigate the risks around that?
Yeah. So, do you mind if I just pop back to the previous question about the
Of
pressures
course.
on government?
Yep.
Okay. So, because this is the rare time I'm going to go back to my defense expertise. So you've got like some real competitive drivers out there, and then you've got some phantom ones, which is more like lore. So there are like concerns around military competitiveness and arms races and that sort of thing in terms of AI in the military space, and to some extent in policing too, with, you know, advanced forms of like digital crime. You've got some economic or market forces, like there's, you know, legislative and economic requirements to do merger review at a specific pace, or drug approval or patent approval, like that sort of thing. I think there's pressure on governments to do those things quickly and well at the same time. I've yet to see any public opinion polling that suggests that the public is, you know, knocking on government's door to do AI.
Mhm.
Like, it's not even one of the top 10 issues facing Canada right now, as in most polls. I get, and the public wants efficient distribution of resources and that sort of thing, which is all good, but there's no, we create a lot of these sort of phantom drivers of innovation for ourselves in order to do things what we really need to do, which is certain things we need to do done very well and very fast at the same time, which are hard problems, and they're complex problems with trade-offs. So that's often where the sticky AI or algorithms sort of start to pop up. Can we use natural language processing to review hundreds of, or thousands and thousands of pages of research and huge data sets? Like these sorts of questions where that competitive or innovative pressure is in my mind valid. And then there's a lot of like the public expects us to act like Netflix, which I don't believe is true. And I've yet to see polling that suggests that it's true. We have to just offer, you know, basic services well and efficiently, and that's it. Like, if there's AI under the hood, I don't think most people care, and I don't think most Canadians even know what that would mean. Because we haven't really had a conversation. Like, it's just been 2 years where we even have a website called Responsible AI in the Government of Canada, and which I think is a good initiative to like start that conversation. But everyone, like the people's focus on public policy issues are pretty narrow and limited to, you know, a handful of issues that are directly impacting them, and so to take up some of that sort of cognitive space with people to start a debate on the degree of that their life is being automated is I would say a luxury in a context of where we're managing a disease right now. So so that as a result, we sort of rely in a way of vanguard organizations or academics that sort of take up the flag on behalf of the public, which is a bit dangerous because, you know, that they don't necessarily represent the public, but they represent certain perspectives to protect the public from a potential from a potential overreach from us. Now to the peer review point. So the idea was to introduce sort of layers of protection or layers of checks. So peer review is not a silver bullet. It is a best practice that was suggested by the National Research Council, who, for many of their products, they do look for peer review to do certain checks on data quality, on the design of the algorithms, etc. So we decided to kind of borrow from that, and it was somewhat inspired by, Ryan, in your post yesterday, you referenced the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada algorithm for temporary residents from China. And for that algorithm, for example, they did submit it to National Research Council to do a vetting of not only the algorithm itself, the data, the processes that IRCC took, the quality assurance processes, etc. So we wanted to sort of codify that as a best practice, because IRCC's data scientists, that their experience was that this was very positive. It did point out very sort of crucial gaps in their assumptions and analysis. So we thought that might work. Again, I don't know if that's actually going to, in itself, filter out bad algorithms or algorithms with like unjust outcomes. But it's one of those layered protective mechanisms that we introduced.
No, that's great. Thanks, Michael. And I appreciate all of those comments. I think that's really helpful. We've had a couple of questions come in on a similar track that I want to pose to the whole panel for reaction to, and essentially it kind of boils down to this notion of, do we always need to have a human in the loop when we're working with algorithms and AI? Ali asked the question around, this notion that in some ways, for AI to reach its full potential in terms of some of the efficiency gains that we would get from it, you would potentially in a future state want it to work fairly autonomously and make decisions by themselves. And Peter had asked the question, I think from the flip side of that, of, if we had, how hard will it be to have a human decision maker, from a political standpoint or administrative standpoint, to be able to overrule an AI that's making a decision on something. And I flag this because what's interesting is, Michael, you're actually flagging the issue around polling. We do a lot of work with Ipsos at IOG, and Ipsos has a study. It's publicly available. I don't have it at my fingertips right now, but it's called Canada Next, and they look at Canadians' views on technology, and they've asked about AI. And what's interesting about that is people tend to support AI decision making when it's things that they don't think are going to impact them personally. So like one of the interesting dichotomies in Ipsos's data was they found that people were actually supportive of AI, for example, making decisions in criminal justice cases, because most people assume they're never going to have to go to jail or go to court, right? That's going to be somebody else that deals with it. But people were actually very opposed to AI making decisions about health benefits that they may qualify for, right? And there was kind of this sense from some of the polling data that people as citizens always want to have a human in the loop. So I throw that question out to the panel, and whoever wants to maybe jump in first on this. I mean, in kind of your, Steve, I'll go over to you on this first. When you're advising clients on this, I mean, is your perspective that there always needs to be kind of a human in the loop or a human decision maker, or are there scenarios where you think you could kind of let the algorithms within a certain domain do its thing?
Sure. So I think, Michael, everybody's hit on this, and Michael, I want to play off one of your commentaries and a comment from Mike K on the chat. But like, most people don't really care about what AI is, right? Like, we got to get back to, what does AI do for government, right? We've kind of given AI, we're starting to treat AI as a noun, right? It's a person, place, or a thing, and really, it's just a tool that we have to automate decisioning, right? Like that's, and maybe I'm being too simplistic, but I really think that we've got to stop thinking about it as this cure-all, as a single entity, and start thinking about it as a range of tools, even, or a series of tools that helps us do things more effectively, right? So the concept, again, I'm going to come back to something, I'm going to take credit for coining it, but this concept of pragmatic AI, where we can do incremental changes to existing processes, existing algorithms, existing decision fabrics, and start to just improve citizen outcomes, right? So it's like, we don't need to have a transformative innovation, right? Michael, you mentioned innovation for innovation's sake. We need to do that. We need to do it as research-based discoveries, not necessarily implementable improvement discoveries, if that makes sense to people, right? So I think this concept of separating pragmatic automated decisioning with innovative AI is probably a decision that departments should make. Shingai, you mentioned having hundreds of engineers, right? In Canada, we have a pretty serious AI ecosystem in terms of startups and things, and I think it's going to be challenging for government to keep engineering talent and compete with the big guys, if that makes sense. So there's a little bit of a skills gap there that we need to talk about. There is a concept here that Mike K, like I truly agree with Mike K. People don't care that AI is being applied to their decision making, but I do believe that they care if a decision is being automated and there's no rationale, transparency for it. I personally don't see, at least in the AI that most government agencies are doing, I think there's some small exceptions. Most of it's got human oversight on it because it needs to. And to be candid, Shingai, you mentioned reinforcement learning. Most government agencies are not implementing reinforced learning where the machine's reinforcing its good behavior. They're doing much more predictive analytics and using automation to make better decisions. So, I don't personally think we're at a place where most decisions inside of business in Canada, if you will, including government, are at that hands-off, let the machine run the business or run the decision. I think we're much more pragmatic. I personally don't think we'll get there for many things, most things. There will be some edge use cases and we'll see how those turn out. So maybe I'm a bit of a Luddite, Alex, to use your term in terms of my my forward thinking. I think AI is going to be implemented pragmatically. I think it's going to be used as a tool to solve problems. And I think we're going to stop talking about it as an entity and start talking about it as just a way to get things done better.
Thanks, Steve. Anybody else want to jump in? Yeah, Alex, I'll go over to you on this. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should always have observability. So if a system is making choices, we should be able to examine those choices, even if they're automated. And I would also say, I mean, I think instead of saying human in the loop, which Renee in the chat has already pointed out is a is a pretty mechanistic way of thinking about human involvement in decision making, I think it should be more about when is AI in the loop? Like when are people being influenced by AI in terms of the decisions that they're making, and sort of how do we conceptualize that, particularly when it comes to government, just because of that elevated sense of responsibility between government and citizens. And I would say, as an example of a system that is hugely consequential, but also automated and is designed actually to have humans not in the loop. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the French system for deciding who gets heart transplants, but that's almost entirely dictated by an algorithm because they wanted to sort of program out the human role in that because they didn't think that it was as fair as if a system was, to Mike's point, sort of setting a set of parameters and saying we're optimizing for the lowest mortality on the wait list and sort of other features, and then saying we're building a system that's meant to sort of drive towards those outcomes, and that there's a feeling in the public that that's a better way of sort of managing something that could be such an emotional sort of set of decisions.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point on that because I do find sometimes in these discussions around AI and kind of the governing of it, there's almost this assumption that human decision making is good all of the time, and we know that humans are biased and humans sometimes can bring a lot of considerations and then have negative outcomes on this, and I always think there are obviously some potential upsides to this as well if it can be kind of constructed in a way where we are trying to look for some more procedural fairness on this, but obviously risks around that as well. Shingai, I want to just actually go back to you for a moment. I mean, both on any of these questions you might want to pick up on, but what it's making me think about is certainly, the educational aspect of this, right? And I'm kind of curious your take on to what degree do you think, kind of average citizens need to have some data literacy, some awareness of this to be able to kind of navigate through this? I mean, I'm thinking about Mike Kajowski's question that he posted around, who kind of makes these decisions around ethics, and part of what strikes me on this is that empowering citizens with knowledge about these systems can be important as part of that. So I'm curious your thoughts on that and any kind of reactions from the work that you're doing.
Yes, so absolutely, we need greater education among policymakers and among the citizenry who are going to be recipients potentially of some of these automated systems that we're going to use. And it comes also to the point around diversity, where I think we need to start pulling in more behavioral economists into the discussion, because we see different behaviors in different contexts. So right now we're in a global pandemic. If artificial intelligence is the winner and comes up with the cure for COVID, we will all be celebrating artificial intelligence, and it will be a noun subsequently, because that's what we need right now. So the pressure is coming from this need. And maybe, the general public won't say we specifically want AI to solve the problem, but they may have an awareness that these advanced technologies will take us closer because they can do computation at rates that traditional methods could not. So that brings us into that behavioral economics discussion, because our people behave differently in different contexts. We're comfortable giving data to our mobile devices, but as soon as government says they need information for us for a contact tracing app, then it's, there's a whole privacy discussion around that, right? So really understanding how people operate, and then that education piece of getting them to appreciate what and how, and we have to be able to explain what and how we're doing. That's just part of the deal when we serve communities, and putting that into our formal education systems and informal education systems, so we hit different people at different layers, in contexts where our traditional education systems are very siloed. So somebody who's learning computer science may not get a module in ethics, because that's just not how our traditional university systems were set up. So really hitting those multiple layers from disciplines, in terms of verticals, in terms of ages, and different levels of participation in the economy, I think is crucial. And that's public policy, policymakers, as well as general public and private sector participants as well.
That's great. Thanks, Shingai. I'm conscious we're coming close to our time. It's always the struggle with these things. They go faster than we would hope sometimes. And I know we've got a number of questions, and we may not have a chance to get to all of them, but I wanted to give a chance for all the panelists to give some closing thoughts on the topic, or anything that we've kind of come up. And one question I guess I want to pose to people that you can respond to as part of kind of a final round on this is, I'm curious your thoughts as we're talking about AI in the context of government. Is there an area that you think that is probably kind of a large opportunity for government to actually embrace some of these tools, where you think, kind of the risks are worth it and there's some real benefits from it? Or conversely, be curious if you have thoughts on if there are areas where government has started to go down this path, where you actually think, to kind of use Alex's terminology, we should use the brakes a little bit on this, and perhaps proceed a little bit slower as we go forward. So kind of curious on your thought as you kind of look ahead to the next, let's say, kind of 3 to 5 years for governments, right? Where are the areas that you think might be most productive for them to invest in this, and where might be the areas where you think they should be most cautious? And certainly any kind of final thoughts you might have on this would certainly be quite interesting. Michael, maybe I'll go over to you first, if you don't mind, on this, and then I'll circle back to the other panelists.
Sure. I'm going to largely dodge it, though, because I don't want to answer too many should questions, given the hat I'm currently wearing. But what I think, I guess the two elements I'm gonna touch on before we go is, the first thing is I think that there are many elements to AI that are increasingly public goods and that affect vast swaths of society. Governments need to get more involved. We already are involved in some of that sort of essential research, absolutely, both funding academic institutions and doing some of our own. I think we do need to invest in some of those sort of core elements to make some of this technology more fair across all sectors. So National Research Council is doing a lot of work on creating corpora of language that could train natural language processing systems to be less sexist. That's sort of we need to do some of that fundamental open research, and governments need to fuel it, and governments need to push it, and then maybe create even the sort of I'm going to borrow a term from Bianca Wiley, but the digital public infrastructure that the private sector can then sort of turn to and rely on more. I'm being starry-eyed here, but that maybe to turn to and borrow from to sort of be better, rather than just us telling them to be better. We can actually sort of maybe give them more tools to be better. and then conversely us as well. And that'll have an impact of like anything we build ourselves, we can base off better data, and anything the private sector builds for us, we can base on good data. We can sort of turn procurement policy to say train on that. That could be really powerful. I don't know. We have to experiment. The second thing is like there's what I've been wrestling with is the question of legitimacy. So long term, this is long term. The more we automate in government, does that whittle away at the expertise that makes the department of X the Department of X? Like the Department of Transport is the Department of Transport because it is legally authorized to be a Department of Transport, and it's full of people who know stuff about transportation. So if you start like getting rid of the second part more and more and more, slowly but surely whittling away in a pace that is so slow you don't even realize it's happening, do you even have a Department of Transport de facto anymore in a few years? And I was obsessed publicly, I was really obsessed with the research by Danielle Yeats Citron and Ryan Kalo about this, about the legitimacy or views of legitimacy of state institutions. The more we automate, the less legitimate it is. Like, how do we identify where to put the brakes? Because that's a more fundamental question that we need to have with the public. So those are my two final points. Thanks.
That's great. No, thanks, Michael. Maybe Alex, I'll go over to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also have a crying child nearby, so I apologize for
No
the background
problem.
noise. COVID, huh? I think in terms of areas, I would say very, very cautious would be any sort of aspect of the punitive state. So whether that's criminal justice, predictive policing, using tools that, are ostensibly meant to keep us safe, but maybe focused on, the perception of safety of certain communities at the expense of sort of feeling of freedom within other communities. And I think that to me is a very dangerous path that I find very frightening, just even how things have been deployed thus far, let alone sort of where we might go next. In terms of areas of opportunity, I mean, I think I would love it if we were more imaginative about the role of the state in the economic picture of AI. I think I'm very convinced by a lot of Mariana Mazzucato's argumentation, where she makes the case that we need much more ambitious investment of government in key industry, so that innovation happens, and that's wonderful, but also that the state is able to both benefit from that expertise, but also from, as the pie gets bigger, the state has more resources to spend to make sure that the sort of runaway development of industries isn't leading to massive inequality. And so I think being more creative about the role that the state plays in these sort of innovative aspects of the economy.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. Shingai, maybe I'll go to you next.
I would, my focus is more on the future. And I think the two areas of big impact are health and education. Health, for obvious reasons, I think COVID is the wake-up call that we all needed, that we, there's a lot that we don't understand about ourselves and our physiology that technology can really help us advance and understand. I absolutely acknowledge that there's bias in those systems. As a Black woman, I'm constantly one of the people that will receive the back end of such biases. However, I do see the opportunity, and I think there's greater scope in what we can achieve through the opportunities and in addressing some of the bias questions now in healthcare. And then the second piece is around education, where you mentioned the Department of Transportation. Is the head of that department going to have a computer science degree in 20 years time, because these systems are so incredibly automated and linked to technology that there's no way that person can effectively do their job without really appreciating the details. So I'm interested in education. What is the Prime Minister of Canada in 20 years time going to look like? What qualifications do they need to have so that they can effectively run a country? So we need to start having that conversation now, because our education systems are so deeply set in their ways, that if we need to start introducing those topics, then at a high school level, that group needs to then advance knowing that these technologies are out there and they will potentially be used more and more in the coming years. Absolutely.
Thank you. Steve, final word over to you.
Yeah, so I'm maybe somewhere between Shingai and today, but I think governments need to do kind of three things in my mind. One, you need to prepare. I think you need to prepare to understand AI, what it means to you, what your definition is, your tolerances for threshold, where you would implement it. I think you need to be prepared to change, both in terms of the speed of adoption and the agility and skills that you need to implement AI. To the other panelists' point, you need to be prepared to deploy what you do. You know, spending 6 months building something that has no outcome that is implementable, that you can actually use, is, as a citizen, it's a waste of money. So don't do it, right? Like, find things that are deployable, not deplorable, deployable and implementable. I think prepare to fail. You're going to have mistakes in this technology space, and things that you think are super great to automate maybe aren't. You think a decision to have it completely, you know, I know there's a lot of debate on humans on the wheel and things, but maybe that decision isn't something that should be automated. So you're going to fail, and be prepared for that. I think be prepared to get your data right. The data is the lifeblood of an AI system. If we don't have that data in a consumable, structured, data private way, your AI is only going to be as good as the data in a lot of senses. So be prepared to get your data right, and be prepared to be agile, because this AI ecosystem and the decision-making fabrics that we're talking about changing are going to need to be agile. On definition, I kind of said it, but define what AI means, define the impact, and define the outer thresholds of what you can do. I think that's an important piece. That definition, whether it comes first or second, it's for you to debate. And then the last thing is align. Align the AI project, the decisioning project, to your technical constraints. You know, most governments do not have significant pools of data science engineers, software development folks. I know there's lots, but like, comparing yourself to a tech company, we have 5,000 PhDs in machine learning and deep learning. So very different, right, in terms of the scale. So be prepared to align your technology stack and your skills stack to what you can realistically accomplish. And then last but not least, the biggest topic of this thing is align your AI decisioning making to the right ethical fabric that you need. Use Michael's work. It is really good work to understand how far down the automation rabbit hole you want to go. So make sure you get those ethical constraints lined up, because that will implement your ability to actually do it, which is why we're talking about this stuff. I think there's a lot of policy conversation on the panel today, which I think is fabulous, but ultimately we need to implement solutions to problems that government has, and you got to do that in an ethical way. So that's my rant for the day.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thanks to all of you. I think this has been a really rich discussion, and appreciate all of you taking the time today to share your viewpoints and engage on this. So huge round of virtual applause to all of our panelists. Thank you for being with us today. As I mentioned, for some of you who may have joined partway through, we have been recording and broadcasting the panel, and within a few minutes, I think after this is done, it'll be up on our YouTube channel for IOG, so you can certainly watch the full panel discussion there. I just want to flag for everybody a couple of housekeeping things on the next steps on this. Our next webinar in the series is going to be happening on October 22nd, so about a month from today. I'm going to be looking at the issues around procurement modernization, which is one of these ones that actually came up a couple times today, but looking at the future of how government adapts its approach to procurement to meet the demands of the digital age. So it should be an interesting discussion, so please join us for that. As I mentioned at the beginning, please do feel free to visit our engagement platform, digital.iog.ca. There'll be a chance for you to engage on some of the questions from today, to share your viewpoints on the survey we have up, and we will be posting some additional materials on there in advance of our next webinar in the series coming up next month. And then finally, we'd love your feedback on today's session. I think Becky has posted a link to a very quick 30-second survey in the chat, and she's putting it up on the screen now. So if you do have 30 seconds before you head off for lunch, please do load up the survey and give us your quick feedback on today's session. So again, thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of you for joining us. This was a great discussion, and look forward to seeing you at the next one in our series on October 22nd. Thanks very much, everybody. All the best.